Hello and most welcome to 1260 of the series, and we are presently recording outside. The sun has decided to show its face. It would be a horrible shame not to get some of its pleasure for once. I think the camera angle will be just horrible, but most important to get some sun. However, need to take in some hot beverage to give some sustenance for chilled joints. I will continue with a single universe by Roberto, Mangabeira, Unger, and of course Smolin, although still we're just covering Roberto Unger. There is no doubt in my mind that this is the way to go about this since Unger is the non-technician. So I continue where I left off in 1259. That such a view cannot be developed and supported without trauma to the... Sorry about this. Need to stop every excess from the cold wind. Oopsies. That such a view cannot be developed and supported without trauma to influential ideas and practices. Within and outside science can immediately be shown by a first impression of its consequences for some of our most widely held scientific and philosophical beliefs. Consider how our conventional ideas about causality are incoherent for reasons largely unrelated to Hume's canonical criticism of them. Causal relations, unlike relations among logical and mathematical propositions, presuppose time. The cause must precede in time its effects. If time is illusory, effects are simultaneous. They are simultaneous with their causes. As a result, no deep distinction then exists between causal and logical connections. We commonly rely on the legitimacy and distinctiveness of causal explanation. To that extent, we assume in our everyday beliefs about causation, as much else, the reality of time. If, however, time goes all the way down, so that the laws of nature are within rather than outside it, then these laws must sooner or later be liable to change. As everything else, they have a history. Causal explanations ordinarily rely on laws of nature, which serve them as warrants. The idea of recurrent and persistent connections among phenomena forms a major, if not the predominant part. Of the understanding of what laws of nature are. However, if time is inclusive and the laws of nature are therefore susceptible to change, all our causal explanations rest on laws that are mutable even when they fail to change. Moreover, an unprejudiced reading of what cosmology has already discovered about the history of the universe may suggest that nature has existed in forms radically different from those that it takes in the mature and observed universe. With its definite structure of elementary constituents, its clear distinctions between states of affairs, of laws, and its severe limitation on the range of what, given any state of affairs, can happen next. When nature fails to exhibit these attributes, causality may exist without laws. If it can exist without laws, it must be a primitive feature of nature. We do better to regard the laws that science is able to establish as codifications of recurrent causal connections in certain states of nature than to see them as the basis and warrant of causal connections. The notion of causality was the notion of causality without laws extends the reach of the idea of the mutability of the laws. It does so by making a historical claim about the universe, that the law-like causality we observe is a characteristic of certain states of the natural world rather than a permanent feature of nature. The development of this idea begins in the rejection of what I earlier described as the second cosmological fallacy. Once we confront these problems, we must change how we think about causation. Our commonplace ideas about causation are confused. They assume that time is real enough to establish the distinction between logical and causal connection, but not so real that it threatens the stability of our causal connections, causal explanations, and the legitimacy of our explanatory procedures. This ramshackle compromise, however, fails to do justice to the truth of the matter. Time is real. The discoveries of science, embodied in the vision of a universal history, have given us, over the course of the last century, increasing reason to acknowledge its all-encompassing reality. The thesis of the inclusive reality of time exposes the trouble in the picture of the world presented by contemporary science, just as it reveals the incoherent character of our conventional beliefs about causation. In the central tradition of physics, time had no sure foothold. In his Scholion about space and time, Newton famously wrote, "Absolute, true, and mathematical time, of itself and from its own nature, flows equably without regard to anything external, and by another name is called duration." In Newton's own physics, however, no basis exists on which so to affirm the reality of time. Newton's laws of motion are time-symmetric. They supply no reason or occasion to distinguish between forward and backward temporal orderings of events. The denial of the reality of time in this Newtonian tradition is not merely an implication of the reversibility of the laws of motion. It is also a consequence of the explanatory approach that we label the Newtonian paradigm. All phenomena are to be explained as if they took place on a trajectory of movement within a well-defined configuration space described by initial conditions that are stipulated to hold for the purpose of that explanation. These same assumed starting points may figure as explained phenomena rather than as stipulated initial conditions for another instance of the same explanatory practice. Given the initial conditions that defines the configuration space and the laws that govern the events within this space, nothing is left to chance. It is possible, in principle, to infer both future and past events from present ones. Thus, present, past, and future can all be held simultaneously in the mind of the observer theoretician. Such obstacles as may exist to this collapse of all moments into a single moment result only from the frailty of our minds and from the imperfection of our knowledge. The observer stands outside the configuration space. He looks upon the events from the vantage point of time symmetric laws expressed in the timeless proposition of mathematics. The regulative ideal to which his knowledge conforms, however inadequate in a particular circumstance, his fulfillment of the ideal may be, is that of the knowledge that God has of the world he made. For such a scientist, past, present, and future are simply now. The Newtonian paradigm presupposes and reinforces a view of time from which physics and cosmology have never completely freed themselves in their subsequent history. According to this view, time